If you grew up playing games in the late 90s, there was an inescapable dominant force that ruled the living room. It wasn't a mascot performer, and it wasn't a sprawling fantasy RPG. It was a first-person shooter on a Nintendo 64 cartridge that forced 4 people to crowd around a tiny television, aggressively screaming at whoever picked Oddjob. GoldenEye 007 was a cultural juggernaut. It completely redefined what a console shooter could be and cemented Nintendo as the undisputed king of local multiplayer. So imagine the sheer, cold sweat running down the backs of the executives at Electronic Arts when they secured the James Bond license for the original PlayStation. They were stepping into the ring against a heavyweight champion, armed with a console that didn't even have 4 controller ports built into the front. You couldn't just make another GoldenEye. Rare had already captured lightning in a bottle. If you tried to copy it exactly, you were setting yourself up for an embarrassing, highly publicised failure. This massive looming shadow created a fascinating identity crisis on the PlayStation. Electronic Arts spent 3 entire games desperately trying to figure out what a 32-bit James Bond experience should actually look like when it wasn't chained to a Nintendo console. They experimented, they pivoted, and they frankly threw everything at the wall just to see what would stick. Some of it worked surprisingly well, and some of it resulted in some of the clunkiest gameplay mechanics of the entire generation. We are looking at that entire chaotic run. We are loading up Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, and the baffling vehicular combat experience that is 007 racing. It is time to grab a Walther PPK, wrestle with some terrible tank controls, and see how the PS1 handled Her Majesty's Secret Service. Welcome to the PSX Index. I'm Parascreen, and this is the show where I play and document all 1,278 PS1 games released across Northern America, and this episode is index entry 92 through to 94. We have just survived another deep dive into the absolute weirdest corners of the PlayStation library, barely escaping human-sized eggs and completely broken space stations. Now it is time to wash off the dirt, put on a freshly tailored tuxedo, and look at one of the most lucrative and highly scrutinised movie licenses in the entire history of the medium. When you look at entries 92, 93 and 94 as a collective trio, you are basically watching a massive publisher workshop their ideas in real time. Because they couldn't rely on the safety net of built-in 4-player deathmatches to sell these discs, they had to lean entirely into the cinematic spectacle of the Pierce Brosnan era. First, they completely shifted the camera to a third-person perspective, largely so you could actually see the expensive digital likeness of the actor they paid for. Then, they pivoted right back to the first-person route by bringing in a completely different development studio to prove they could, in fact, make a highly competent shooter. And finally, in a move of pure, unadulterated late 90s corporate synergy, they just shoved Bond into a highly modified racing engine, handed him some missiles, and called it a day. It is a fascinating, heavily flawed, and slightly clunky 3-game run, so grab a martini, shaken obviously, and let's see exactly how Electronic Arts navigated the dangerous waters of international espionage on the PlayStation 1.
Dino, we should probably go and greet her.
We start the run with index entry 92, Tomorrow Never Dies. Released in late 1999, this was Electronic Arts' very first swing at the franchise, and you can practically feel the boardroom anxiety baked directly into the code. The developers, Black Ops Entertainment, knew that if they released a standard first-person shooter, it would immediately be held up against the N64 giant and torn to absolute shreds by every gaming magazine on the planet. So they executed a massive pivot. They pulled the camera completely out of Bond's head and shifted to a third-person perspective. On paper, it actually makes a lot of business sense for a movie tie-in. If you spent just a massive chunk of your development budget securing the official likeness rights of Pierce Brosnan, you probably want the player to actually be able to look at his digital face for the entire game. It was a clear attempt to shift the genre away from pure shooter into an action-adventure space that games like Tomb Raider and Siphon Filter were currently dominating on the console. You aren't just shooting nameless guards in the face in tight corridors. The game tries to open things up. You are skiing down snowy mountains, awkwardly sneaking around military bases, and driving heavily armed BMWs. They desperately wanted it to feel like a playable cinematic experience rather than a multiplayer deathmatch. But while pulling the camera back successfully solved the immediate problem of the GoldenEye comparisons, it introduced an entirely new, incredibly frustrating set of issues. Because the second you actually put the controller in your hands and tried to make the world's most famous secret agent walk in a straight line, that sleek cinematic illusion completely falls apart. Let's be completely honest, James Bond is supposed to be the absolute pinnacle of suave, calculated precision. He is a highly trained, elite government assassin, but in Tomorrow Never Dies, Pierce Brosnan handles less like a lethal secret agent and more like a heavily armoured shopping cart with a stuck wheel. The game relies heavily on those classic late 90s tank controls. Now, that movement scheme was barely acceptable while you were slowly creeping around a quiet mansion, avoiding slow-moving zombies in Resident Evil, but when you are actively trying to dodge automatic gunfire from 5 different henchmen in a Russian military base, having to completely stop, slowly rotate your entire body on a central axis, and then press forward is a massive liability. It genuinely feels like you are parallel parking a forklift on a sheet of ice. To compensate for the fact that aiming manually with a PlayStation D-pad was practically impossible, the developers implemented an incredibly aggressive auto-aim system. Your gun will just violently snap to the nearest available target. It works fine in empty hallways, right up until you actually need to shoot a specific explosive barrel, and Bond decides he would much rather lock onto a completely harmless guard standing 3 miles away behind a solid concrete wall. It completely shatters the spy fantasy. You aren't slipping silently through the shadows. You are awkwardly bumping into door frames and hoping the auto-aim does the heavy lifting while you absorb bullets. It is a game that looks fantastic in still screenshots on the back of a jewel case, but the second you try to actually play it, the cinematic illusion falls completely flat on its blocky face. After the clunky, forklift-like handling of Tomorrow Never Dies, Electronic Arts clearly realised that forcing tank controls into a high-octane espionage action game was a massive mistake. So for Index Entry 93, The World Is Not Enough, they completely changed their strategy. They benched Black Ops Entertainment and handed the keys to the franchise over to Eurocom and made the bold decision to pivot right back to the first-person perspective. Instead of running away from the shadow of GoldenEye, Eurocom decided to sprint directly towards it. They looked at the N64 giant not as an intimidating rival, but as an architectural blueprint, and honestly, it is genuinely shocking how well they managed to pull it off on the PlayStation hardware. This is the game where the franchise actually remembers that James Bond is a covert spy, not just a highly durable man who owns a machine gun. The World Is Not Enough brings back the core tenets of what made the late 90s espionage games so incredibly satisfying. You aren't just holding down the right trigger until the room is completely empty, you are utilising actual MI6 gadgets. You are using your watch laser to quietly cut the hinges of locked doors, you are using covert comms, and you are pulling out a sniper rifle to clearly clear a path before you ever step foot into a hostile area. But the biggest, most impactful upgrade here is the artificial intelligence. In the previous game, enemies largely just stood in place and waited patiently for you to slowly rotate your body and shoot them. Here, the guards actually have a shred of self-preservation. They will sprint for alarm panels if they spot you, they will dive behind metal crates for cover, and they will actively try to flank your position if you stay hidden for too long. It completely changes the pacing of the gunfights. You actually have to think, plan your approach, and act like an elite operative. For the first time on the console, EA finally managed to deliver a Bond experience that didn't feel like a compromise. The real tragedy of The World Is Not Enough on the PlayStation isn't the gameplay, it is the legacy. If you bring up James Bond first-person shooters from the late 90s or early 2000s, the conversation is immediately and aggressively hijacked by the Nintendo 64. People will talk about GoldenEye until they are blue in the face, and they might even bring up the N64 version of this exact same title, which was actually developed by an entirely different studio and featured that coveted 4-player multiplayer mode. Because of that console war dynamic, Eurocom's PS1 version was almost immediately swept under the rug of gaming history, and that is a massive shame, because it is genuinely one of the most competent, atmospheric shooters on the console's entire library. The developers fully understood that the PlayStation excelled at cinematic presentation, and they leaned into it heavily. You get fully voiced dialogue, highly qualified FMV clips cut straight from the movie, and a brilliant soundtrack that dynamically reacts to the action unfolding on the screen. The mission variety is fantastic too. You aren't just running through endless repetitive grey military bunkers. 1 minute you are navigating the neon-soaked tension of the Russian casino, trying to maintain your cover, and the next you are caught in a frantic, high-stakes shootout inside the London subway station. The environments feel lived in and distinct, which was no small feat for a console that constantly struggled to render complex 3D geometry without the walls warping and tearing at the seams. It definitively proves that the PS1 was entirely capable of hosting a top-tier, shareable first-person shooter, but because it didn't have 4 controller ports built into the front of the plastic, and because it lacked the chaotic friendship-ending multiplayer deathmatches of its Nintendo rival, it simply faded into obscurity. It is the definition of a hidden gem, a fantastic, tightly designed spy thriller that absolutely deserves to be pulled out of the bargain bin and respected for what it managed to pull off. By the time we reach Index Entry 94, the franchise's identity crisis hits an absolute undeniable peak. Electronic Arts had already tried the third-person cinematic approach, and they had successfully pulled off an atmospheric first-person shooter. So what was the logical next step for the world's most sophisticated secret agent? Apparently, it was ripping the espionage entirely out of the equation and shoving him into a vernacular combat game. 007 Racing is the ultimate example of late 90s corporate synergy. EA was already sitting on the highly successful, widely praised Need for Speed engine. They also had this incredibly expensive movie license. Somewhere in the boardroom, a terrifyingly simple equation was formed. They realised they didn't actually need to build complex enemy patrol routes, elaborate stealth mechanics, or detailed character models. They could just take their existing racing technology, slap a Sylvan Aston Martin DB5 onto the front of the dual case, bolt some surface-to-air missiles to the hood, and sell it as a mainline Bond title. It is a completely baffling cash-in that abandons almost everything that makes the property appealing. You never actually see the spy outside of a few cutscenes. You are just a heavily armed car driving around mostly empty grey environments. They marketed it as a high-octane thriller, but in practice, It felt like someone had just played Spy Hunter in 1983 and spent a decade trying to figure out how to awkwardly translate it into 32-bit polygons. The developer, Yu Chinks, was essentially tasked with turning a driving engine into an objective-based military shooter. It resulted in a game that doesn't really excel at being a traditional racer, nor does it succeed at being a Bond game. It sits in this bizarre, uncomfortable middle ground, serving as living proof of just how desperate the publisher was to monetize the license from every conceivable angle without having to step back into the shadow of the N64.
Well, it seems we've cleared customs, Cherise.
Thank you, Mr. Bond.
Call me James.
What is it?
We've got company. I had a few optional extras installed for just such occasions. Let's give our guest the slip, shall we? Hold on. Love a drive in the country, don't you?
The minute you actually hit the accelerator in 007 Racing, the sheer absurdity of the concept really sets in. This isn't a racing game in the traditional sense. You are not trying to shave seconds off a lap time or gracefully drift around the hairpin turns of Monaco. Instead, it feels like a weird, politely British version of Twisted Metal. The campaign strings together a series of objective-based missions that completely strip away any notion of suave, undercover espionage and replace it with pure, aggressive demolition derby mechanics. You are given a garage full of iconic franchise wheels, the classic Aston Martin DB5, the Lotus Esprit, the BMW Z3, and then the Q branch essentially tells you to go cause as much property damage as legally possible. You spend your time driving around these surprisingly large open maps, deploying oil slicks, dropping smoke screens, and firing Stinger missiles at generic enemy henchmen driving incredibly blocky vans. But the core problem here is the control scheme. Trying to manage the physics of the heavy rear-wheel drive sports car while simultaneously trying to manually aim a machine gun at an attack helicopter hovering above you is an absolute nightmare on a PS1 controller. You'd end up in these hilarious, incredibly awkward situations where James Bond, the ultimate highly trained assassin, is furiously reversing back and forth in a tight alleyway, desperately trying to line up his headlights with a stationary barrel while absorbing heavy machine gun fire. The physics engine was clearly designed for standard track racing, not complex vehicular combat, so the cars feel entirely too light. Hit a small bump in the road while firing a rocket, and your incredibly expensive, state-of-the-art spy car will violently flip in the air like a piece of cardboard. It is chaotic, it is deeply clunky, and it completely misses the point of the license. But in a weird, late 90s arcade way, it is also a fascinating train wreck to play. It perfectly encapsulates the pure desperation of a publisher throwing every single genre at the wall, just trying to see how they could squeeze the James Bond name onto the console without having to make another traditional first-person shooter.
Careful, hotshot. I don't want to be digging your grave.
For the love of country, 007, do hurry up!
That's it. Now launch the car off the jetty.
It's a good thing I asked for the water damage waiver. Well, that was a splashing success.
Looking back at this free game run, It serves as the perfect time capsule of a massive publisher desperately trying to solve an impossible problem. Electronic Arts held the most expensive, highly structurized movie license in the world, and instead of just throwing in the towel because they couldn't directly replicate the local multiplayer dominance of the Nintendo 64, they simply experimented. They threw the kitchen sink at the PlayStation hardware. They gave us the deeply clunky third-person pivot, a genuinely brilliant and tragically forgotten first-person shooter, and a completely unhinged vernacular combat game, all just to see what the 32-bit market would actually buy. It is a chaotic, incredibly disjointed legacy, but it is undeniably fascinating. They proved that the system could handle the high stakes of the international espionage, even if Pierce Brosnan occasionally controlled like a broken shopping cart. It wasn't always pretty, but surviving this volatile spy trilogy means we are officially 94 games down, with 1,184 games to go. If you want to help the channel chip away at the massive number, hit subscribe. Next time on the Index, we are taking a much needed breather before we hit the massive milestone of entry 100. We are leaving the high stakes espionage behind, grabbing a handful of quarters and looking at the pure, unadulterated retro history of Namco Museum Volumes 1 through to 5. It is a 5-disc arcade palette cleanser, and it is exactly what we need. Click a playlist on your screen to keep the trip going, and I'll see you in the arcade.
I hear field operatives use every means at their disposal to achieve their objectives. Shall we celebrate, James?